Hello everyone, welcome to the I Am IT Geek YouTube channel. My name is Shabazz Dar and I am the IT Geek. This is episode 3 in the multi-factor authentication series. Just want to give a quick recap as to what we covered in episodes 1 and 2. So in episode 1 we had an introduction to MFA and the requirements, including licensing. We then went on to episode 2 where we went a bit more hands-on and went into the admin portal. We enabled multi-factor authentication by configuring a conditional access policy. I then went ahead and tested that with a user with the relevant licensing to show the sort of experience a user would have with text authentication. So let's just go into a quick introduction into episode 3, where we're going to configure additional multi-factor authentication settings. So we're going to have an overview of what these settings are. They'll include the authentication options and the settings. We'll show the trusted locations. We'll have an overview and a look at account lockout, fraud alerts and notifications. And finally, we'll have a look at the service and user settings for multi-factor authentication and what configuration options you have for that as well. So here, we're logged into the Azure Active Directory Admin Center. And we want to go down to the security menu option, which is here. Select that. And you'll find throughout the video that we spend most of our time in the security section, which is where all the multi-factor authentication settings are. We're looking for the authentication methods. So that's about halfway down if we click on that. And here we find a couple of options, and I'll go through both shortly. So in the middle here, we can see that we have 3 options, and I mentioned this in the introduction that we had a few different options. One of them was the FIDO2 security key. So that's a physical piece of hardware that you need for the second form of authentication. We've got the Microsoft Authenticator passwordless sign-in option. And they've also got the text message. And you notice we don't have any configuration options for phone authentication because it can't really get simpler than that, and I don't think there are any additional things we can configure for it. So you notice they're all disabled at this point. So if we just click on FIDO security key first, and then we see the bottom of the page becomes active, and we've got the option there to enable it. From here we can use for sign-in or strong authentication, and it's essentially we can either for all users, or we can select users, select a group. So this gives me all the options for users. I can just click on that Mfa users group that I created in the previous video that we saw. And I've got a few more additional options here. So do we want to enforce it? Yes or no? Do we want to enforce key restrictions? Yes or no? And then if we enable that, I'll explain what that error means in a second. We can also restrict specific keys. We can allow them or block them. Now with the AA GUID, this is essentially the hardware serial key kind of ID that's on the text file that we receive when we purchase these FIDO2 keys. I think I mentioned in my first video that I don't actually have any of these hardware keys, so I can't really go into much more detail or show how they're configured. But essentially that's where here down at the bottom where it says add, we would add the GUID that we've imported already into Azure Active Directory. Like I said, for the purpose of this video, we're not going to be enabling this as I don't have any keys to go by, so we'll just discard all that. So now if we go down and select Microsoft Authenticator passwordless sign-in, we see again that the bottom of the window has changed. So this is all the settings, very similar to the FIDO2 security key options. We can enable, and then we've got a target audience. We can either do all users or select a specific group like we did last time. So there's not many additional options as there were for the FIDO2 security. If we move down to the last one, which is a text message, again, same as before, I can enable it. Select all users, or we can select specific users via a group, like I created the Mfa user group. So those are the three authentication methods we have that we can configure. I just want to go on to this second option that we can manage here, which is password protection. So this is like a password protection policy, and it allows us to configure several different settings here, which we'll just go through. So the custom smart lockout, so I've got lockout threshold. So this is essentially how many failed sign-ins are allowed for the account before the first lockout. So it's set to 10, which is pretty generous if you ask me. I'd go a lot lower than that. We've got lockout duration, so this is how many seconds is it locked out for. So the minimum length in seconds of each lockout. So you can set however many seconds. Obviously it's set to 60 for now, which is a minute. You have here the option to ban custom passwords. So if you enforce this, if we go yes, you can basically then insert a list of words, one per line, to prevent users from using those passwords essentially. And you can can contain up to 1,000 words as well, which is quite a lot of passwords. So you can have password 123, password admin, stuff like that. You can essentially put in there and just add items to the list to block those. We're not going to configure that, we're just looking at the settings here. So here's the password protection for if you've got a hybrid identity management in place. So you can, which is enabled by default. We'll just hover over that. So if you set it to yes, password protection is turned on for Active Directory domain controllers when the appropriate agent is installed. So you obviously need to have the Azure AD Connect installed and an agent for that to be allowed. If we click on this final one here, if it's set to force, the mode, users will be prevented from setting banned passwords and the attempt will be logged. So we can audit it and enforce it. So we'll discard all those settings as we don't want to save any of those. So now we've had a look at the authentication options and the settings around that. We saw there were three authentication methods you could configure: the FIDO2 hardware key option, the Microsoft Authenticator app options, and there was also options around text messages to enable those. So now we're going to move on to trusted locations. So we're back in the Azure Active Directory main menu. What we're going to be looking for are the trusted locations. So if we go back down to security, as I mentioned, we're going to find ourselves in this area quite a bit. If we click on named locations, this is broken down into two specific options: new location or trusted IPs. So as you can see, there's nothing in here at the moment. It's blank, it's empty. So we're going to click on new location, and we can call this what we want. So I'll just call it test office. We're going to delete this anyway. So now we can define the location using two options, either IP ranges or country and regions. So if I just click on the IP range, so if you notice here, it's an actual specific range, not a static IP, but it has to be one with a subnet at the end of it. So if we just go, I'm just going to put 99.99.99.99/27. So if you notice before I put the / notation in, the subnet mask, it was asking me at the bottom to say that I had to fix something. So if I click on /27, that goes away and we're able to get the green tick. So here, as you can see, I've got an option to mark as a trusted location. So signing in from a trusted location lowers a user's sign-in risk. Only mark this location as trusted if you know the IP ranges entered are established and credible to your organization. So what you're doing here is adding in offices of yours. So if you've got several offices around the world, you want to add those as trusted. The other option is if we go to country and regions, we can add a specific country that we trust. So let's just go to United Kingdom, and we can add that as well. So I'm not going to add anything to the policy here, so I'll just click OK to go back. Second option here is to configure Mfa Trusted IPs. Now this will actually be covered later on in the user and service settings, but we will just take a quick look as it is relevant to the trusted locations as well. So this is the user and service settings that we're going to go through in more detail later, but here we can add specific trusted IPs. Now, as you notice here, these are all private ranges, whereas on the previous page, we had to, when we were doing a new location, they had to be public IP address ranges. So the reason this is private IP addresses are covered as well is that for customers or clients that have a VPN connection, so if you have a VPN connection from Azure into your on-premises network, technically you can get to these private IP address ranges. So if you enter them here and you're able to get to them, they will be valid and they will be trusted IPs. So that was just where we can add those. We'll go through all these settings later on in the video. So that was trusted locations, where we saw named locations and trusted IP addresses. Next, I'd like to take a look at account lockouts, fraud alerts and notifications. So we're wanting to have a look at the account lockout, fraud alert and notifications area now. So if we go back down to security, as you can see, first of all, we're here in the Azure Active Directory dashboard, main menu. Click on security, where we found ourselves for most of this video. And to get to the account lockout settings, we want to go to MFA. And here we have a number of different options. So we click on account lockout. So here we have an option to do some more in-depth configuration for temporary account lockouts. So as I read just here at the top, temporarily lock accounts in the multi-factor authentication service if there are too many denied authentication attempts in a row. So this feature only applies to users who enter a PIN to authenticate. So here we can put the number of tries. So you've got between 1 and 99. So let's just go 73. Don't know why I chose that number, just first thing that came to my head. So that's a number of MFA denials to trigger account lockout. That's quite a few actually, so we'll change that to 5. That's a bit more fair. So the next setting is the minutes until account lockout counter is reset. So you've got, again, between 1 minute and 1,440 minutes. In the comments, let's see if anybody can tell me how many hours that is. I am not even going to try and work it out. But if we go for 3 minutes for now, the final setting here is minutes until account is automatically unblocked. So again, we've got the option between 1 minute and 9,999. So I'll put that at 15 minutes. So again, we can have a discard or we can save these settings. Again, I'm not going to configure this, so we're just going to discard those settings. So we're going to look at fraud alerts now. So a couple of options below account lockout where we were just now. Click on fraud alert. So this is the option to configure if you want to allow your users to report fraudulent attempts to log into their account. So if you think about it, you're on holiday, you're away from the office, you're not working, and you get a second form of verification prompt on your mobile device. That's obviously not you, and you want to be able to report that. So with these settings here, we can allow our users to do that. So we want to allow it, so click on. And by default, it's set to automatically block users who report fraud. So I recommend leaving this on, because what that does is, obviously they're on holiday, they don't need their account for now. So if it blocks the account, it means that no one can log in with that account. So it gives you time to investigate and be secure at the same time. Final option here is the code number to report during the initial greeting. So if we just look at the prerequisites here, the value must not be empty and the value must be a number. So if I just go 9, for example, that's fine. Or you can do 152. So any sort of number. Obviously you need to make your users who you enable this for aware what the number is. And that obviously shouldn't be given to anyone outside your organization. So we'll just discard those settings. I don't want to save that. So one of the final bits I want to look at on this section is the notifications option. So just one below there is notifications. Click on that. So this allows us to configure an email address where we're going to send notifications to around multi-factor authentication. So I will put in my email address. Oops, spelled .com wrong. I'm not sure how you can do that, but it's a typo. So if we add that and save that, any alerts around fraud alerts or any security risks will be emailed to that address. So I'll just take that away because we're not going to save that. And those were the three sort of main options that I wanted to look at. But if we take a look, there are plenty more options. So I'll just do a quick overview of what these options are. So we've got blocked and unblocked users here. You can specify specific users you want to block. So if you have an account and you see there's loads of attempts to get into that account, and again for security reasons you can add that to your block list. And again, if there's a user where you want to unblock it and they're on your block list, you can unblock it as well. Auth tokens, this is where we upload the hardware serial numbers for the auth tokens, which we mentioned earlier in this video. So you can import the numbers that you get from your vendor in this location and then configure them where I showed in the initial part of the video. Here are some phone call settings. So we can just go MFA caller ID number, US phone numbers only. We can enable the operator required to transfer extensions, number of PIN attempts to allow per call, and you can add a greeting there as well. I'm not going to go into too much detail around this. You've got an option for providers, so this is different phone providers, but again we've got nothing configured here. Let's go a bit further down. We've got manage MFA server. Now I'm not sure why this option's still here because this was discontinued, I believe. But if we do click on here, and exactly, yep. So there we see almost like a warning that as of July the 1st, 2019, Microsoft will no longer offer MFA Server for new deployments. So I believe if you've already got a deployment within your tenancy from before this date, it's still supported, but we can't configure it because this is going to be a new class as a new deployment. So we've got one-time bypass, so allow a user to authenticate without performing two-step verification for a limited time. So if you've got, I can't even really understand a reason why you'd want to disable this. Let's say someone's mobile phone's getting replaced and they're going to have it in the next 2 days. You could bypass it for that amount of time, so they could until they get their phone back and they can download the app again. An option for caching rules, so you'd set up caching rules so that consecutive authentications don't require two-step verification. Again, this is for the MFA server. Again, all these options are for the MFA server, which we don't have, but this is for users who do have it, for clients that do have it. Got some reporting here, and we can do reports in the last 24 hours, 7 days, 30 days. And finally, you've got the troubleshooting option there if you want to report a service request or report an issue. So that was the account lockout settings, the fraud alerts and the notification settings. I also showed some additional other options you had around the security MFA features. I'd now like to finish off by going into the user and service settings for MFA. So we're back in the Azure Active Directory dashboard here, and what we want is the MFA service and user settings. Unlike the rest of the settings that we've been looking at, which were down in the security option, we're actually going to find the MFA user and service settings within users. So let's click on users. Here we can see all the list of users that we have, and we have a lot of different options here, and we also have some options on the top here, and one of them is multi-factor authentication. So we click on that and that'll open up another window. So here we are. These are the multi-factor authentication user and service settings. So at the moment we're on the users tab. As you can see there, we've got a list of all our users and it shows that they should all be disabled. So here we have the option to search for a specific item. So we can do sign in allowed users. Click on that. It'll show us billing administrators, which we have none of. global admins, which we have several. That is my account there. Password administrators, and you get the gist basically. So if we go back to sign allowed users, that'll show everybody. And on the right hand side here, we have an option to show either any, which is everyone, enabled or enforced users. So we've not got it enabled for anyone, and we've not got it enforced for anyone at the moment. Final option here is to actually bulk update. So we'll click on this option. Once it's loaded, it should allow us to bulk update multiple users. So you essentially do it from a CSV file. So looking at the CSV file and how that's put together is outside the scope of this video, but that is an option you can do. So this user settings are pretty straightforward, and not really a lot of configuration here, just being able to enable or enforce users. If we click on service settings, so we have much more options here. So if we start down up at the top, we've got app passwords. So here we can allow users to create app passwords for Outlook, SharePoint and OneDrive and applications like that for non-browser apps. So SharePoint Online isn't covered, but OneDrive and Exchange, Outlook 2016 and 2019 are covered. Or we can select do not allow users to create app passwords, so they'll just be prompted for when they go into browser. So SharePoint Online, Exchange Online, etc. Leave it on the default. This is the trusted IPs that we mentioned before. So we've got an option here where you can skip MFA for authentication for requests from federated users on my intranet. So if we tick that, that's the private IP address ranges that I mentioned. So this is where we'd add the private IP addresses. So 10.10.10.1/24. And if that was our private subnet on premises, then that would be exempt from multi-factor authentication. So anybody signed in from that IP address would not have to do the multi-factor authentication. So it's quite a handy tool, quite a handy option, if you want to exempt people in the office. Because you'd think your offices are secure enough, really, aren't they? You've got the physical security, so you know the people who are in the office, and and they're in plain sight. So unless you've got really lax security, physical security in your tenant offices or your client offices, this is always a good option to configure. If we go down to verification options, this is where you can essentially enable or disable the options you want your users to have for the authentication methods. So if you only want your users to be able to use the mobile app, you'd untick everything and just leave that there. And what this will do is this will allow them to only be able to register through the notifications through the mobile app. And then when they go into their Office 365 account, they'll also not have any of these options for authentication methods, so they can't change them either. The final option here is to remember multi-factor authentication on trusted devices. So if you want to allow users to only have to authenticate once a week, you could enable this and then select 7 days. And again, depending on what your security policy is, you could set that. So you can do anything between 1 and 365 days, so 1 day and 1 year essentially. So it's got to be on trusted devices as well. So that brings an end to episode 3. So I'm going to go over a quick summary of what we looked at in this episode. So we started off by looking at the authentication options and settings under security in the Azure AD portal. We then looked at trusted locations, which included named locations and trusted IPs. We had a look through the account lockouts, the fraud alerts and notification settings. There are also a number of other settings we looked at, like the Mfa Server, but that's not relevant unless you have an existing Mfa Server. Finally, we just looked at the users and service settings for MFA. Thank you for joining me in this episode. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment or hit me up on Twitter at @ShabazDar. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. In the final video of the MFA series coming out next week, We're going to show how to enable password write back in a hybrid environment, and also we're going to set up self-service password reset. Thank you, and until next time, goodbye.